Hey folks, and welcome to Chapter 17 on the Biopsychology of Emotion. One thing you'll notice as emblematic of this picture from the Scream, Edvard Munch, is that a lot of psychology work on emotion has dealt with fear. This is a pretty universal emotion across different species, but we'll talk about emotion a little bit more generally, and we'll also talk about stress. So here's your overview. In this video, we're going to cover the basic theories about how your biology relates to fear, the relationship between your physiological responses and your emotional responses. In the following videos, then, we'll talk about how we communicate emotions, and then we'll talk about parts of the brain involved in emotion, including the amygdala, but also beyond the amygdala. And then finally, we're going to talk about stress and how it relates to health. Let's get started on this first big question about how your autonomic nervous system, or your physiology more generally, relates to fear. And this is a classic question in psychology. Some of the earliest psychological researchers were dealing with this question as they developed techniques to measure your body and then relate that to psychology scientifically. Now, the common sense idea around emotion that a lot of people hold, though not everybody, right, is that there's this kind of sequence from where it's our emotions, our conscious feelings that cause our physiological responses. So the reason my heart races is because I'm scared, right? So I'm going to see something like a bear in the woods that's going to cause me to feel the emotion of fear. And once I feel the emotion of fear, right, I'm then going to have a physiological response that's the result of feeling afraid, right? Same thing for other emotions, right? So the reason I get a butterfly feeling in my stomach is because I'm in love. So the love happens first, and then the feeling, or then the physiological response. Or I smile because I'm happy, right? So happy happens first, and then I smile in response to being happy. Now, early researchers, including William James and Lang, different researchers working on the same problem, proposed essentially the opposite, that our physiological responses happen first, and then it's our physiological responses that cause our emotions, right? So here, it's going to be your heart racing that causes you to think that you're scared. Or it's going to be that butterfly feeling in your stomach that tells you that you're in love, or the smiling that tells you that you're happy, right? So in this case, I need to have a physiological response to the perception of the bear. If the bear causes my body to react, then I'm going to say, oh, I must be afraid, right? So this, you can see how this kind of flips things on its head, but it's still a sequence which is going to be important, right? So I see the thing, and then in one view, I feel the emotion first, and then my body reacts. And in the other view, my body reacts, and then I feel the emotion. So let's think about this James Lang theory and see how it holds up. There's a few predictions that you could make from a really kind of strict view of the James Lang theory. And the strict view would be that, I can't have an emotion unless I have a physiological response, right? That it's necessary and sufficient to get an emotion if I have the physiological reaction. Now, if we take that really strict view and we look at people who can't feel autonomic responses, we should predict that they can't feel emotions, right? But this isn't completely true. So people who are paralyzed from the neck down can't feel their heart rate changing, can't feel those butterflies in their stomach, because there's no sensation reaching their brain for conscious perception. There's some reduction in the intensity of their emotional responses if you're paralyzed, but you can still feel emotions. You can still feel afraid even if you can't feel your heart racing. So a very strict view of that doesn't seem to hold up. For people who can't express emotions, right, that smiling idea, right, like people with Mobius syndrome, as you can see on the page here, a couple of people getting married, who have, in Mobius syndrome, you have weakened facial muscles that prevent facial expressions. The thing is, people with Mobius syndrome still feel emotions. They can still feel happy even though their faces can't form a smile. So again, a very strict view that like I have to smile to feel happy, or I have to be able to feel my heart racing to feel scared. A very strict view of that doesn't seem to hold up in terms of it being either being necessary to feel the emotion. A third prediction comes from what's called the facial feedback hypothesis. And the idea behind the facial feedback hypothesis is that if I make a face that indicates an emotion, that should be sufficient to feel the emotion. So here's that bit more on the facial feedback hypothesis. So expressing emotion should be sufficient and lead to greater feelings of that emotion, right? So you put on a happy face, you're going to feel happy. This was tested in the 80s with a kind of a cool study where they had people put pens in their mouth, and either the pen was in between their teeth, and so it made a smile even though the person wasn't intentionally smiling, or they put a pen between their lips so it formed kind of a frown even though the person wasn't actively intentionally frowning. And the early studies on this reported significant results where people making the smiling face more easily felt happy, and people making the frowning face more easily felt anger when they were exposed to things, to slides or comics and that sort of thing. There's also some evidence from Botox treatments, which paralyze facial muscles, that those reduce emotional responses. They don't prevent them, but they reduce them. So there's some evidence for this facial feedback hypothesis. The problem is that while the early research on facial feedback seemed to show significant results over here, many labs attempted to replicate this finding using the same technique and failed to do so. And follow-ups over the subsequent years suggested that there may be a very small effect. So making that smiling face may have a very small, very inconsistent on your effect on your emotional responses, and certainly isn't sufficient or necessary to feel the emotion. So again, a very kind of strict view that physiology always comes first and always has to precede the emotion doesn't seem to be consistent with the data. And so we might look for a view that's not so sequential, right? And one of those views was the Cannon-Bard theory, where because physiological responses aren't necessary or sufficient to feel emotions, maybe feelings and physiology are completely independent of one another, right? So I see the bear, and then I have two separate parallel streams. One of them goes to my feeling of the emotion, and one of them goes to my physiological response. So they just happen at the same time, but independently. I think I'm scared, and my heart is racing. I think I'm in love, and I have that butterfly feeling in my stomach. Now this handles the issue of, doing a smiling face doesn't automatically cause the feeling and isn't necessary to have the feeling, right? So it deals with that issue, but it doesn't deal with the evidence that shows that there's some dampening of responses from Botox, and there's some dampening responses from paralyzation, right? And that there might be a small effect of facial feedback, right? So they're not completely independent, so this Cannon-Bard theory doesn't quite hold up either. And so a modern biopsychological view kind of integrates these a little bit, where we've got two parallel factors, like Cannon-Bard suggested. You've got the feelings and the physiology, but that they support one another. Okay, so they're not completely separate. So my physiology might get ramped up, and that'll amplify my feelings. And my feelings that I think about consciously may cascade down to a physiological response, so they're going to interact with one another. They're also going to affect my perceptions too, right? So you might, which neither of the other theories dealt with, this route back to seeing the bear in the first place, right? So if I might be more likely to notice the bear or hear the bear or be on the lookout for the bear if I'm already scared, right? Or if my physiology is already ramped up for some other reason. Okay, so this kind of supporting view is kind of a more modern perspective on the relationship between your body and your emotions, that there's going to be interactions between these factors. And we can think about a fun experiment from the 1970s in light of this modern biopsychological view. And in this experiment, they had people cross a bridge, a suspension bridge that you can see on the page here. This is me crossing that bridge. It's 230 feet high, and it's kind of scary. They had people cross this bridge, or they had them cross one on the ground, so it's not suspended. And on the other side of the bridge, there was a Confederate. There was a young woman on the other side, and everybody in the study was a straight young man. Okay? So there's a young woman on the other side of the bridge, and she asked them a bunch of questions about their emotions, about the bridge, all these kinds of things. She also gave them her phone number in case they wanted to contact her with any questions. Right? The people who crossed the suspension bridge rated the Confederate as more attractive and were more likely to call the Confederate for a date in the following days, as compared to the people who crossed the bridge on the lower level. And the idea here is, right, that we've got these separate pathways through our perceptions, our physiological responses, and our emotions. And because of that, we might misattribute arousal from one source, which is the fear of heights, for another source, excitement or romantic interest, as we integrate those parallel streams, right? So my heart is racing, and I'm perceiving the bridge, but I'm also perceiving this person on the other side of the bridge, right? And so I could feel a different emotion. Instead of fear, I could feel excitement, right? Because of those interacting relationships. This also leads to some dating advice. The only dating advice I'm going to give you, which is when you go on dates, do something exciting, because then your date will think that you're exciting. All this talk about the relationship between physiological responses and emotions is relevant for talking about lie detection, particularly polygraph tests, right, which is built on the idea of measuring your physiology, your autonomic nervous system, and indexing that to emotions. Now, the classic way of doing a polygraph test is the controlled question technique, where you test whether guilty people will experience more physiological arousal when lying versus a neutral question. So you ask somebody a neutral question like, is your name blank, right? And they say yes or no. And then you ask them a question about, like, did you commit this crime, right? And they say yes or no. And if you get a physiological response that's higher than neutral, then we might determine that somebody is lying, right? Now, here's the problem with the controlled question technique and why it doesn't work very well, which is that physiology and conscious emotion are separate, right? Arousal is not specific to lying, just like it's not specific to crossing a bridge, right? So my conscious experience and my physiological experience may be related to one another, but they're not the same thing. So just this classic controlled question technique that you see in movies a lot of the time just doesn't work very well. You can't tell whether somebody's lying specifically. You can just tell that they're having an emotional response or a physiological response. Sorry. There's a technique that works a little bit better, which is called the guilty knowledge technique, where you present a question that only a guilty person would know is crime related, right? So maybe there's something at the scene of the crime that only somebody who was there would know was at the scene of the crime, okay? And you ask them, ask them something about that object, right? Or ask them something about that time of day, right? Or ask them something that only somebody who was there would know about, okay? in that case, if you're innocent, the question would be neutral. But if you're guilty, then the question should give you an emotion. So this is different than asking, did you commit the crime, which is going to potentially lead to an emotional response for everybody, because they don't want to get accused of a crime, right? But if you just ask somebody about, is the house yellow? Did you go to a yellow house, right? That would be a neutral question for somebody who didn't go to a yellow house, right? But if the crime happened at a yellow house, then the guilty person may have an emotional response to that because they're trying to hide it. So that works a little bit better. So lie detection can be problematic because of this imperfect relationship between physiology and emotions. But if you're very careful with it, some people are working on techniques to make it a little more reliable.